Welcome to Audio Gyan with Kedar Nimkar, a podcast that documents insightful conversations with Indian designers, artists, musicians, writers, thinkers, and creatives of all types. Catch us on iTunes or visit audiogyan.com for more Gyan sessions. Here's your host, Kedar Nimkar.
Today I have Aziza Iqbal with us on Audio Gyan. She is an Indian visual artist, surface design and pattern specialist currently based in Doha, Qatar. The quintessential maths nerd and pattern junkie. She thrives on details, grids, and symmetry and believes in communicating with shapes and colors rather than words and pictures. So, welcome to Audio Gyan, Aziza. Thank you for giving us your time, and it's a great honor to have you on Audio Gyan.
Thank you, Kedar, for having me. It's good to be here. It's nice to chat with you. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Sure. I'll set the context. We'll be talking about geometry overall in design and try and understand some nuances of your work and how you have been working along patterns and stuff like that. So, the first thing which I wanted to ask you is what's the role of geometry in design and art as well?
Well, actually, geometry, interestingly, is actually the foundation of life itself. It's a foundation of nature. You see it all around you, and it is, in my opinion, or I don't know if you would call it an opinion, I feel it is a science of proportion. Like geometry is a spatial sort of science, and I think as in design and in art, we are always making those decisions of proportion, of placement, of some sort of harmony. And this is natural because, like I said, geometry comes from nature. If you look at a leaf or a flower, there is a certain symmetry in it, there is harmony in it. So in that sense, I feel geometry, art is just imitating that in that sense, in design. And if you look at, for example, typography, you may not be consciously doing geometry, but when you're designing a font or you're doing some typography, you're always looking at proportions and spacing and things like that, and that is all based on rules of geometry. So I feel it's a natural part. As humans, we are always seeking harmony in some way or the other, and this comes from ourselves. It comes from nature. It comes from creation itself, which is math, basically.
Yeah, interesting. So how do patterns influence design? I mean, since uh, like uh, like you specialize in patterns and grids and symmetry overall. So can we like discuss more about understanding how do patterns generally influence design? I mean, can a simple pattern be objectively called as an art form or a form of design or like how?
Well, of course, I feel pattern is a language in itself. I don't see it as just a filler space or a decorative piece of work. I feel there is a language to it. I feel that there is a there is some communication that these shapes and this rhythm does to you. So I definitely feel that pattern is independent of design in a sense. So it can be considered art. It can be considered a part of design. It can change the design because patterns are also like they have their own. Like you have gentle patterns, you have aggressive kind of design, and this is all abstract. Like basically, a pattern is something abstract, and by definition, a pattern is something that has some sort of symmetry. It repeats, right? So these sort of things definitely influence if they are used in design in some way or by themselves. I do see it as like if you look at, for example, any sort of old architectural building, like one of my favorite places, Humayun's tomb, for example. If you go there and you look at one of the jalis, it's a work of art, right? It is beautiful. It plays with light. It has some sort of interaction with you. It does something. It has some sort of it has a voice, and that's how I feel about pattern. I feel that they all have like you can relate a story without actually saying anything. So and that is actually what I do because I've always not been very good at drawing, for example. So for me, using a grid, using geometry to actually make these patterns that can actually communicate what I'm trying to say. This is my way of illustration. It's not something that I could do conventionally, and this is something that I've always been interested in, that is maths and geometry and things like that. So definitely I feel patterns are independent of illustration and design in a way, and they can definitely be considered art and not just decorative space filler, like I said.
So, are there any instances of pattern used in design and it has worked as a function, or that form particularly has given some sort of a function within the design?
Well, like a best example that I just gave is a jali. It has a function. The function is two ways. The function is privacy. The function is, transmitting light. But if you could just take just straight lines, for example, and you could cover a window with it, right? It is a pattern in a sense, but it's just not got any sort of intricacy in it. It does the job. But then when you put a pattern, a geometric pattern or a arabesque pattern to it, it adds beauty, it does the function, and at the same time, it's kind of, it is a piece of work, artwork as well. So I guess that would be one example that I can think of right off the top of my head, because I love rallies personally. But, and I feel that they are a beautiful example of a combination of function and visual, So that is probably one of the examples I can think of.
Yeah, I like the window example also. It's quite beautiful. Yeah, so what do you see when you see a pattern? I mean, are you looking for patterns constantly in your process?
Always.
Okay, so
always,
how does that
always.
process
I've
work?
always
Can you elaborate on how does that process work and how does that help you in your work?
I've always been into pattern. I've always been kind of looking at sort of repeat units. I don't know if it's a kind of OCD thing or I don't know what it is, but basically in a sense that I'm looking at rhythm, in a sense. I'm looking at shapes, lines. I'm looking at angles. I'm looking at repeat units, for example. So I would say there are two types of things I'm looking for. One, when I'm actually looking at a pattern that I'm trying to analyze. That's a completely different process. Second is just in general, I'm looking around. I go somewhere and go to a hotel and I see a pattern on the ceiling. So I'm looking at that. I'm trying to observe, okay, this is where it started. This is where it repeats. This is where the line of symmetry is. So obviously there's a lot going on. That is in general. And then there are patterns that I'm trying to analyze. For example, I look at a geometric pattern of some sort of door somewhere and I want to analyze it. So then I'm thinking of what type of symmetry is it? Is it a 4-fold symmetry? Is it a 5-fold symmetry? In the sense, how many axes it has. So it's quite nerdy, but that is basically the first few steps of looking into analyzing, and this is basically what's going on in my head most of the time, looking at patterns all the time. I'm surrounded by them in my studio and endless source of inspiration for me. But yeah, and even in general, I'm always looking for things like, just traveling and things like that. So I guess I'm constantly looking for the sort of rhythms, I would say.
Yeah, that's nice to see so much passion overall in one domain. So I wanted to just slightly elaborate more on understanding this pattern bit where, like, if we'll start off with slightly defining what is a pattern. I should have asked that much earlier, but like, we can continue this. Like, if you can define what is a pattern and how patterns emerge overall.
Well, basically, a very brief dictionary definition of a pattern is something or a sequence of an arrangement that repeats, right? So if something doesn't repeat or it is not symmetrical, I wouldn't call it a pattern. It would just be an abstract, yeah? So a pattern, by definition, has to repeat in some way. If it's a set of a simple shape that just goes on, like, for example, polka dots. polka dots is a pattern. It's a simple unit. It just repeats itself. So that's a pattern. And then you see even, for example, on I would say maybe animal patterns, like you see cheetah. It is not exactly the same as polka dots, but it's still repeating. There is still some sort of rule behind how it repeats. So that's also a pattern. In terms of geometry, more specifically like Archimedean geometry or Islamic geometry, which is what I specialize in, there are repeat units and there are symmetries. You see a lateral symmetry where the pattern repeats next to each other. You see radial symmetry where you could, like for example, you could say like mandalas are very popular these days for meditation and people love drawing them. And in a sense that the mandala is kind of something that is just, it's just there. It's a circular form. But it has a repeat unit. If you see, it repeats on a radial axis, right? So it's still called a pattern. So patterns are basically defined by repetition in a way. And that repetition doesn't have to be regular, but there is still repetition. So that's what a pattern is. And how it emerges, that depends on every single pattern where you could just look at, there are millions and millions of them. So, it's hard to define that. But generally speaking, a pattern is something, and another thing is that it can fill space, which is why it's very useful in architecture, in textiles, and useful in design as well. So I feel it is a very multifunctional tool, and it has so much variation and it has so much depth to it. So I think that it's hard to define exactly one pattern, but there are so many types. So this is in a nutshell. Basically, I gave you a Wikipedia sort of definition of pattern, basically.
Mm-hmm. So, this is very interesting to understand because if I am asking you as a lay person, where if in a general sense you can also say that a pattern is a form which has a time aspect to it, like it repeats after a particular time in a
Right.
general sense. So, can you give any parameters which help define that this is a pattern in art or in general on any surface, probably?
I'm not sure if I understand the question because pattern repeats itself. You could say that.
Sorry, but there are certain patterns, right? Like there are certain patterns which are identified based on certain parameters, right? Like it repeats after 10 times. Like as you mentioned about the cheetah skin or the lion coat, which, yeah. So are there any parameters which help to understand that these things are in pattern?
Well, that is where actually grids come in. There are certain patterns that repeat themselves on different types of grids. Yeah. So you could take a hexagon, you could put a pattern in it, but you could repeat the hexagon in many different ways. You could take this is actually part of Archimedean geometry, where there are three basic shapes that are perfect space filling shapes. One is a square, one is an equilateral triangle, one is a hexagon. So basically that means is these shapes can touch each other perfectly and fill the entire space. If you look at any other shape, for example, an octagon which has 8 sides or a pentagon they cannot fill the space. You need another shape to support it, right? So now what I'm trying to say is you can take combinations of these shapes and create very many different patterns using just different layouts. So it doesn't have the parameters are probably, I would say, in the grid, and the pattern is basically sitting inside the grid. So the grid is actually the first thing that we need to, when I'm trying to, when you ask me if I'm looking at patterns, I'm always trying to identify the grid. That's one other thing that I would say. That is the underlying order behind something that repeats itself. So you kind of, so the grid defines that. So that is what you're wondering about, is that those are the parameters. You can make a grid of, like, for example, you can use a square and an octagon. So when you look at a pattern, you can't really see, but you can see that it's not really going straight. It's got some sort of movement to it because it has a different grid inside it, right? So this is something very, very advanced, I know, but it's basically, this is what you're looking for when you're trying to look at a pattern and you're trying to understand how is it doing this repeat, how is it, how is it moving along. So this is one of the ways I would say that you're looking at you're looking for the underlying grid, basically.
Yeah. So, but what happens if the pattern itself is anarchic? I mean, there, like, are there challenges while identifying? Because, like, just imagine, or you can give an example where there's a ceiling in some of the churches where certain things are in pattern, but they are so huge that it's not that we as without understanding the science behind it, without understanding the geometry behind it, it's very tough to identify, right? So is are there instances, or can you give some examples where the pattern itself is anarchic and it has taken a long time to identify that yes, this happens in a pattern? So I might just go slightly philosophical here, like even the earth moves in a pattern, right? So which must have been identified after like many thousands of years. So are there any simple examples like that?
Well, for one thing is that if a pattern is anarchic, then it would be a paradox, because if it does not follow an order, then it's not a pattern. It's just by itself. Secondly, I have,
No, but the
yeah.
sorry, but the anarchy happens at regular intervals.
Then it's just a demi-regular grid. It's still not anarchic then. So pure anarchy would be completely that it breaks out of the grid. But for example, I have to say a couple of things that there are times when you see a pattern that doesn't make sense, for example. And this happens a lot nowadays. This is one of my pet peeves. It happens a lot nowadays where you see designers who try to replicate patterns that are from history, but they don't know how it's working. So there is some sort of deviation in them. So it does take time. For one thing, you see that and you're like, oh, it's not working. Something's wrong with it. And then you realize it's because the harmony was lost at some point. So that is one thing that happens when it comes to patterns that are not, that have not been formulated properly. And I'm primarily talking about sacred geometry and geometry in general, where the pattern has been, in today's time, with AutoCAD and Illustrator, it's very easy to just look at something and trace it. But it doesn't always form itself harmoniously. And that is something that is, in my mind, anarchy, So if I'm passing by and I see something that, like a brochure which has used a pattern that is historically used, for example, and it's off, so then I consider that as anarchy. I'm like, okay, this is not, it doesn't fit into the grid. It's breaking off from the grid or something like that. So I'm not sure if this was the question, but this is something that I would consider. And secondly, like the word geometry itself, it's very interesting you bring up the Earth's rotation, because the word geometry itself means earth measure. Like it is the Greek geometry is measure. So the geometry has always existed. It was offered for public consumption actually by the ancient Greeks. So that's why the word geometry is used. It's Euclid's elements. If you've heard of them, that was probably one that is one of the first textbooks of geometry itself. So it basically concerns itself with spatial arrangement and relationships of points and planes. So these sort of things have existed for centuries. It's that, like I said, because right in the beginning, it's part of nature. It's part of our body. We are bilaterally symmetrical creatures, for example. So there is symmetry even in us, even though it's not perfect symmetry, but there is symmetry even in us. Another fun fact is, if you've heard of the Fibonacci sequence, have you heard of the Fibonacci? So you have the numbers that add up 1, 3, 5. Your human hand, the proportion of your fingertip to your elbow is in the Fibonacci sequence. So, like we are surrounded by this geometry. We're surrounded by this harmony. And so it just makes sense that we are looking to produce that harmony in our work and in our, visual spaces, in our even art, for example. So you always have that. So I think that when it's basically when that's not something's not working in the harmony, that's when I would say there is anarchy in the pattern or in the geometry, for example.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. uh, yeah, so Aziza, I would like to actually conclude with one last question, which I think should take up a good amount of explanation. It's slightly philosophical. I tried to connect with a pattern to a man's routine, and yeah, and like if I mean, there's a very old saying which I heard, that when you don't know Zen, rivers are rivers and mountains are mountains. When you know Zen, sorry, when you're learning Zen, rivers are not rivers and mountains are not mountains. And when you have learned Zen, rivers are rivers, mountains are mountains. So it's a pattern where a person tries to break from his regular monotonous life, and and so and then break that pattern to like get into something more, which is much more challenging. So how do you see overall art with respect to patterns where you wish to break the routine? And so I this is where I'm coming from, that people are generally inclined towards breaking patterns, right? They are more towards changing the monotonous life. And is there something similar which happens in design also, where yes, we stick to symmetry, we stick to geometry, but there are certain instances where you want to break the pattern, to make something feel much more advanced, or slightly differentiate from the foreground or the background. So how does that work? I mean, is like, why is there a need to break the pattern?
Yeah. Firstly, I feel there are two types of people, and I think one type of people is basically the creatures of habit, which is why a pattern is formed to begin with. Because pattern, it gives comfort. Like when you have a certain routine every day. I would say one side of the spectrum, one type of people, it gives them comfort, right? So if breaking the pattern is routine, like if it's something you want to do all the time, then that is the pattern. You see, because then it's not the exception that proves the rule. The exception is that you're trying to break the pattern, because the rule is that you are in the pattern. Secondly, I feel like there is definitely a need every now and then to break out, because that is also human nature. Because by humans, we are insatiable. We want to always try something else. So once the comfort of the pattern starts becoming a little too uncomfortable, you want to break out. You want to do asymmetry. You want to try something. But even that, I would say, if it has to work, especially in design, you can't just have, like, if you look at abstract art, for example, you just throw some paint on the page, and then it doesn't work like that. There has to be some sort of harmony to it. So even with asymmetry, even with breaking out of the pattern, you still need to have some sort of harmony with it. But definitely that is a part of human nature. I feel that you want to break that, but after a while you find you want to go back to the routine, because you find that comfort in it. So especially for me, because for me my work also is the way I live. I like the routine, So and then every now and then I'm like, oh, I'm so bored of this. I need to try something else. So that is just human nature, I feel. And visually, visual patterns and our life, they are similar, but they're not the same. So a routine in our life, a pattern in our life, we may want to break out, but a pattern that you see visually, it works. And then when it breaks out, it adds that element of surprise. So that is a useful tool that is used in design or is used in art and things like that. So definitely there is that, because I think that is also a human tendency to do that, that we are actually all rebels, So somewhere or the other, we want to kind of try something new. We want to try what we've never tried before. And I guess that's how it works. But at the same time, like for me, a grid, like I said, because I was never really good at drawing, A grid for me, it gives me comfort. It gives me that inspiration that, oh, I have a grid, I'm going to make whatever I want. And it's a big misconception that patterns are very, that they're monotonous or that they're very repetitive in the sense that they're not very creative. When in fact, if I give you a grid, you could put like 2 million patterns in it, like different sorts of arrangements, so there's so many. So I never actually find the need to break out of the pattern, because the pattern itself is infinite and it's always inspiring and it's always kind of changing itself in its own rules. So I have never personally felt that I want to break out of this pattern or I want to try, something completely different. In that sense, because I find these things are endlessly inspiring. If you look at nature, or if you look at, like patterns exist on a macro level and a micro level, like solar systems, you see the spirals, you cut open a cauliflower, you see a fractal in it. So, these things are not accidental, and these things are definitely inspiring in a sense that you don't feel that you could ever tire of them. This is my personal view, So I feel like a pattern or geometry or some sort of harmony in nature itself is so inspiring. Do you ever look at nature and be like, oh, I want to break the monotony? It's not, because it's not monotonous. That's the beauty of it. If it's harmonious, it's never going to be monotonous. And this is, I think, the same rule we can apply to our lives, that if there is some sort of harmony in our lifestyle, there's some sort of balance in our lifestyle, we won't feel the need to break out of it, right? So this is the same, I feel, rule. The visual aspect of it works, and it also works in the lifestyle. You have balance, you have harmony, you don't feel the monotony. The monotony comes when you have too much of something and too little of something, or there's imbalance, I would say. But balance and harmony is always essential, and it doesn't matter if there is a routine or not. So this is something that I personally feel I'm very for the routine, and of course, we break out of the routine every now and then, but I'm very for the way patterns work, even in life and in visual art and in nature especially, because that is endlessly inspiring,
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because this gives a different perspective also, and it answers one of my questions very indirectly, that when you want something to be shown with some prominence, it's best to be laid out on a pattern. So, like when there is a pattern, and you break the pattern to show something, and then you continue with your pattern again. So it's
Exactly.
kind of, yeah, it's beautiful.
Because it is a tool of communication, definitely. Because like one of my favorite artists, one of her quotes is like, it just describes me. Georgia O'Keeffe said that I found I could say things with colors and shapes, things I couldn't say any other way, things that I had no words for. And what is a pattern? It's color and shape, and that pretty much says everything. So you could say it by being completely symmetrical. You could say it by breaking out of the symmetry. Either way, you're saying something, So that is basically exactly what the point is, that it is a communication tool as much as anything else.
Absolutely. Uh, cool. So I would like to just conclude with one more question, which was just touching upon how has, like, this is slightly a personal one. Like, what are you doing these days? What are your next plans of working along with patterns, and how has Culture Shop overall promoted your work? And like, can you just briefly explain that bit, and then yeah.
So at the moment, I'm actually working on a couple of commissions. I'm also working on an exhibition next year in sculpture, which I've never done before. I have absolutely no idea, but I'm really excited about it. So I'm working on that. For Culture Shop, I think probably one of my most favorite projects has been Mumtaz. And that was an amazing opportunity, because again, it was a very neat thing to do. The brief was represent your favorite city, and I can't do a skyline, so I was like, I'm going to do a pattern. So that was a really amazing project for me, very close to me. and I'm excited that Mumtaz is coming along now in different products and stuff like that. And yeah, basically that's basically it. Right now that this is what I'm doing, working on some new commissions and things like that.
Cool. I think this is a good note to end this. Uh, I had like really good time talking to you, and also got to know some more things about patterns, and definitely like lot of food for thought here to dive into this subject more and explore it further. So thank you, Aziza, for giving your time on AudioGAN, and I hope to have you again.
Thank you so much, Keda. It's been really good fun.
So that's it from today's GAN session with Aziza Iqbal. Stay tuned for more GAN on AudioGAN next week. Till then, bye.